Kairiti Hetairoi. Today we begin our examination of the history of the British Isles by looking at the ancient Greek perspective of Britain and the North Sea. Far removed from the Mediterranean home of the Greeks, Britain was a land of mystery, every bit as exotic, if decidedly less alluring, than India. As we shall see, Britain had long been figured into civilized trade well before Homer composed his epics. Yet, Britain's emergence onto the stage of history, the written past, would only occur when Greek civilization was entering its Hellenistic period, by which time the Greeks had already invented comedy, tragedy, and philosophy, while the Parthenon had stood atop the Athenian Acropolis for a full century. In this episode, we will investigate what the Greeks knew about Britain, how they acquired their information, and why their understanding of British geography was so imprecise. The significance of the speculations of the Greek geographers, I will argue, is that Britain was defined early on as a peripheral area and a tertiary concern. This attitude they passed on to the Romans, whose high culture consisted mostly of translating Greek thought into Latin. Understanding Britain's lack of centrality to the Greeks and Romans will, I hope, illuminate the true significance of Britain's rise to international eminence in the medieval period and beyond. There are a number of ways to define what constitutes civilization, and as you might imagine, that is one of the key discussions for people who study early history. For our purposes here, we'll use the traditional historical definition of civilization as just being a society which has writing. And it turns out that writing corresponded fairly neatly with the development of bronze in Sumer. Sumer is in what is now southern Iraq. And both of these technologies were invented around 3500 BCE. To get bronze, however, you need two substances to make the alloy. You need copper, which is pretty easily found in a lot of places, and then you need tin, which is more rare. The best places to get tin were in Spain, or Iberia as it was known at the time, still known as the Iberian Peninsula, and in southwest Britain, Cornwall. These were the two areas where tin was most abundant. And so, from a very early time, tin was being extracted from Britain and then sent through trade networks all the way to the Middle East. So many of the bronze instruments used in Sumer and then much later in, say, ancient Greece had their origins, at least in terms of the metal used to make them, all the way up in Britain. That being said, although Britain was a major part of the supply network and clearly important for the development of civilization, it really didn't have a place in the story, because Bronze Age civilization was rather slow to spread, and in fact the first Bronze Age civilization in Europe proper didn't emerge until about 1750 BCE, and this is when the Mycenaean civilization sprang up in Greece. We know from their records in Linear B that these were the ancestors of the later Greeks. So, still though, even though this is a lot closer to Britain than Sumer, there's still very little direct contact. And in fact, there's a pretty good chance, almost a certainty, that the Mycenaeans had no idea that Britain was there. So, due to the distance between Britain and the centers of literature in the Bronze Age, despite the fact that Britain's tin was significant for the survival and growth of these societies around the Mediterranean and stretching east, they probably didn't know that the island was there or had a clue as to who was inhabiting it. Most likely, the Celts, who as we'll see will play a major role in British history, were either middlemen in the trade in Central Europe, or they may have already been inhabiting the islands at this date. That's a controversy we'll get to at a later time. Suffice it to say for now, though, that Britain was a silent partner in the Bronze Age. The Phoenicians hold the distinction of being the first named civilization to have contact with the island of Britain. And again, by civilization, I mean a society which produces writing. The Phoenicians during the Bronze Age had been a minor power. They had been a people subjected to border wars between the New Kingdom Egyptians and the Hittites to the north. But then, with the Bronze Age collapse and the retreat or disappearance of the great Bronze Age empires, the Phoenicians have been left independent. So while the rest of the world was in something like a Great Depression, the Phoenicians had their golden age, and they were then able to take over much of the trade throughout the Mediterranean. This is also when they began to heavily colonize the Western Mediterranean. So even after the rise of the Greeks after 800, and the Greeks of course would go on to be rivals to the Phoenicians. In fact, although the Roman-Carthaginian rivalry became more famous, at first the rivalry that Carthage had was mostly with Syracuse and Greek colonies on Sicily. But at any rate, the Phoenicians would retain their reputation as being the preeminent sailors of the Mediterranean even after the Greeks began to really glorify the idea of going out and plying the wine dark sea. And the Phoenicians in particular were known for long-distance voyages of exploration. They were looking for exotic goods. And so, while we don't have their records directly, they did have a lot of contact with the Greeks, and the Greeks often relayed what Phoenician sailors said. In fact, Herodotus, one of the most famous Greek historians, tells us a story about how Phoenician sailors actually sailed all the way around the west coast of Africa and entered the land around what we now call Cameroon. And by this point, there were no common languages between anyone on the ship and the locals, so in order to exchange goods, they resorted to bartering, where each side would lay out all of their goods on blankets and then retreat to allow the other side to inspect and then lay out a counteroffer. So we know from Herodotus that the Phoenicians, or at least their Carthaginian colonists, made it about as far as Cameroon. And Herodotus, or another Greek source, tells us that another Carthaginian sailor, Himilco, actually managed to make it to Britain around 450 BCE. So this would be even before the Peloponnesian War. That being said, the details of what the Phoenicians were up to are fairly scarce, and a lot of that is due to the paucity of our sources on the Phoenicians and Carthaginians. You will recall that Rome famously wiped Carthage off the map, and also that the Emperor Claudius wrote a history of Carthage, but that it has not survived to the present. With some of the new texts being discovered, or I should say recovered, at Herculaneum right now, one wonders if we will be able to learn more about what the Phoenicians were up to. A number of Phoenicians actually wrote in Greek during this period. Greek was kind of an international language of culture, and even if they hadn't, their own native language was basically identical to Hebrew. So regardless of what language they might have used for their text, if we can find one of them, there are a lot of scholars who would be able to translate them and add to our knowledge in relatively short order. So keep your fingers crossed. There's a good chance that we'll be learning more about Phoenician expeditions in the future. But alas, as things currently stand, we have to rely only on the ancient Greeks. The first man to be seriously interested in geography was the father of history, Herodotus. His detractors might add that he is often called the father of lies, because some of his stories seem to beggar belief, but we could also refer to him as the father of geography and the father of anthropology, because he is very interested in all of these subjects. In fact, history as a discipline was not really defined by Herodotus. Herodotus, in fact, called his work the investigation, which is what historia literally means. But he was interested in a whole host of things. And we know that he was an avid traveler. He was born in Western Asia Minor, and then he migrated to Athens. Later on, in his mature years, he went from Athens to the new colony at Thurii in southern Italy. We also know from his writing that he must have spent significant amounts of time in Egypt looking at various things, and I believe that his signature has been found on the top of the Great Pyramid. So Herodotus was someone who, by the standards of his time, was extraordinarily well-traveled. But as you can tell from the scope of the map, this still means that he only visited a pretty small section of the world, even as he understood it. And the farther away one gets from the Mediterranean, the less clear his understanding was. Plato once said that the Greeks are like frogs around a pond, the pond, of course, being the Mediterranean. And there's a lot of truth in that, because this was what really defined their understanding of life, nature, and everything else. While a number of Greek writers will give some indication that they understand things like the correlation between going north and colder temperatures, Herodotus's writings don't really reflect that in a clear way, which might sound weird, but consider this. When he's describing what might lie north of the river Ister, or Danube as we call it now, he says that among the leading theories is that the land is completely inhabited by giant bees. And he doesn't seem to realize that if the land were as cold as one might imagine, given that you just keep going farther and farther north, that most likely it wouldn't be able to sustain massive insects. I mean, to be fair, I guess Alaska has some giant mosquitoes, but just to think that the dominant species in an area would be giant bees seems rather bizarre. He also says the area might just be completely uninhabited. He doesn't really offer a specific reason for that. So, again, a lot of what Herodotus is able to tell us about areas beyond the Mediterranean is either speculation or it is based on travelers' tales that he himself thinks are somewhat ridiculous but kind of fun, so he relates them anyway. And we'll see that this will remain a pattern for a very long time, even after Greeks have a way to establish some certainty about what lies beyond the Mediterranean world. Probably the most famous Greek explorer, and certainly the most important for our purposes today, was Pytheas of Massilia. He was born around 350 BCE, so the late classical period, meaning that by the time that he was old enough to explore, Alexander was either in the middle of his conquest of Persia or had already died. Pytheas, by this point, was going on his own exploration. Massilia, for context, is in southern Gaul. It is today's Marseille. This means that Pytheas would have had a lot of contact with the Gallic tribes to his north, who are the same as the Celts, and also a lot of contact with the Phoenician colonists in the western Mediterranean, who were the preeminent sailors of the time. And between those two sources, most likely, he learned that there was a lot to see on what we now call the North Sea. And so he decided to make his own voyage there. Unlike a lot of other explorers, presumably the Carthaginian explorers we talked about earlier, such as Himilco, went out with his own ship and crew, we don't really know what kind of resources Pytheas had. It's possible that he had his own ship where he was in command, but it's also possible he simply went along with some Gauls or Phoenicians, and he was merely a passenger. It's not really clear from the state of our knowledge right now. He traveled all throughout the North Sea region. He visited Britain, he visited probably Scandinavia, and some think he even visited Iceland. His account of all this was called the Periplus, which is sometimes translated into English as on the ocean, even though it really just means the voyage around. But this work has been lost to us. It still exists in about 20 fragments, but these are mostly just small quotes and paraphrases from Strabo and other later geographers. That being said, while the work hasn't survived to the present, it was immensely influential and popular in its own time, because the claims that Pytheas made were shocking, but also revolutionary. He was not only an explorer, but apparently a rather great thinker, one of the greatest lost thinkers that we tend to think of more as an explorer than an intellectual, but that would be to sell him short, as his observations were quite keen and important. In the Periplus, if our later writers are any indication, Pytheas made a number of observations about things in Britain and in the North Sea more broadly. He pointed out, for instance, that the tides of the North Sea and the Atlantic more broadly are a great deal more violent than the tides in the Mediterranean, and that sailors have to be a lot more cautious with where they land and what preparations they make. That was something that, while Pythias talked about it apparently at great length and also described massive waves and other things that seemed like exaggerations, that seems like something that later readers, including Julius Caesar, didn't take too seriously, and that will have some consequences for Caesar that we'll get into later. Pythias also described drinking something that sounds a lot like a local beer, and he was the first Greek to write about amber and the midnight sun phenomenon, which is where, when you are at a significant latitude, that the sun during the summer doesn't really seem to set. It kind of gets dusky and then the sun will start to come back up, or so it seems. And of course, the days during the winter are extremely short when you're in the far north. But of all the claims that Pythias made that were mocked in many ways, the one that really stood out is that he claimed that if you go far enough north, there's this jelly-like substance. It's neither sea nor air nor land. And it's not easy to categorize. He doesn't really know how to describe it even. Of course, he's talking about ice, but again, the Greeks are a Mediterranean society, and so for them, the idea of a massive concentration of ice is incomprehensible unless you actually see it for yourself. They have about 1 million words for traveling and going, but to the best of my knowledge, I don't think Classical Greek had a word for snow. I could be wrong about that. I haven't checked, but anyway. Pythias also describes something that one could translate as a sea lung, and the historian of Greek geography, Duane Roller, thinks that that might be a description of how ice can creak and groan and crack. So perhaps as he was observing a glacier or another massive deposit of ice, he heard the sounds it was making and thought it was breathing in a way. At any rate, if you've never seen these things and you've never been outside of the Mediterranean, if you're an armchair scholar who's used to a Mediterranean climate, all of this sounds like traveler's tales. It sounds no more plausible than the idea of a land full of giant bees. In addition to Britain, which he describes apparently in a fair amount of detail, he also describes other places such as Thule and Scandia. And we don't really know exactly where these places might have been. Some scholars think that Thule was somewhere in Norway. Others think that it was Iceland. It's really unclear. And again, many different modern interpreters have come up with their own explanations. Also, in Tacitus's biography of his father-in-law, the Agricola, they name one of the islands right around Britain, maybe something like the Isle of Wight, as Thule. So there was debate as to what island would have what name, and it was kind of hard to really reproduce all of this without an accurate physical map, which, as we'll get into, was not something that existed. So, again, it's hard to really know the exact claims that Pythias made because we don't have the Periplus, but we do have an idea of the range of his interests, which was quite interesting. He clearly was interested in the science of the North and the culture, so in many ways he was a kind of Herodotus of the North Sea. But, again, hopefully one day we might have the luxury of reading his text and figuring out exactly what he saw and what he was claiming. For the most part, although his work was a bestseller, to the extent that something at the time could be a bestseller, his claims were widely ridiculed, more so than they were repeated. And I will explain why that's the case, why Pythias was largely not believed. The reason why Pythias had so much difficulty finding acceptance was because the Greeks were, at heart, an agonistic culture. That is to say that they were competitive in every aspect of life. In sports, of course, people competed for crowns and prizes. When they wrote dramas, they would put on their plays and audiences would vote for the one which was the best. Politicians would put forward proposals and people would then vote on which one to follow. In intellectual life, they also were just as competitive. People would put forward their explanations for what the one true substance was, what virtue might be, what had happened at some battle 100 years ago, the true identity of Homer, or whatever was being debated at the time. And the person who would be correct was the person who won the debate. And so normally the person with the stronger argument would come out ahead. But in some cases, the person who was the better debater would win. And we don't really know if Pythias ever traveled to the seat of Greek culture in the East to really debate in person, or whether this was left to others. But it appears that while his ideas were in circulation, most of the people promoting his ideas were apparently not very good at debating. This was a danger, of course, that Plato had predicted when he denounced sophistry. That being said, of course, his creation of sophistry as a category of analysis was self-serving, but we'll leave that aside for now. The point is that if you wanted to be correct in the Greek world, you had to prove your point through debate. It wasn't enough to go into a laboratory or have a really good argument. You had to actually debate people in public, or at least through writing. That's also why, by the way, the Greeks eventually settled upon the idea that the Earth was the center of the solar system, because the astronomers who were supporters of that thesis ended up beating out the supporters of Aristarchus of Samos, who said that the sun was the center of the solar system. But again, for the most part, the more correct position tended to win. But these are just some examples of when that system doesn't quite pan out. One of the big problems Pythias ran into, in terms of a specific argument that he and his supporters could never overcome, was that the Greeks were obsessed with a geographical paradigm, which insisted upon geometrical symmetry for the world. So when trying to envision the world and why it stayed upright, why the land always remained above water and above the earth as a whole, they had to try to figure out what made that balance hold. And so they kind of understood by this point that the earth was round. That's actually not a very new discovery, that was well established by this time. And so one way that they figured that this could be the case is if the amount of land and water was in a ratio. And the prevailing theory here was that Europe, Asia, and Africa, the three known continents, must all be equal in mass, and that all of them were basically big triangles. And so that's why a lot of the early maps of Europe imagine Europe going just kind of straight north to a greater extent than it actually does. And it also underestimates by quite a bit the size of Africa and Asia. And anyone who wanted to upset the apple cart of how much land there was or wasn't would run afoul of the paradigm, and they would be mocked for saying something that would make the earth imbalanced, and it could presumably tip over. So the idea is that Pythias's claims must be ridiculous because they simply can't be true. Otherwise, the earth wouldn't work the way that we observe. Another problem Pythias had was the problem of snobbery. The kinds of people who were debating him, if they were stationed in a place like Athens or Alexandria or Antioch, would consider themselves and be considered by others to be more authoritative. They had bigger and better libraries, more access to the established cultures of the Near East, more funding, and they could cite a lot of other authors and traditions that Pythias probably couldn't get access to out in the West. And so they would effectively pull the I am from a more civilized area than you are, the modern equivalent of which would be kind of like just claiming to be from a more prestigious university or a more cultured area. So say somebody in London sneering at someone from Manchester and saying, well, I'm from a capital of civilization, you're from a backwater, and therefore, all things being equal, I believe that my position is probably superior. And so if you're wondering why Pythias's ideas were not fully accepted, this is effectively why. Compared to the modern world, the Greeks and Romans very much put a heavy emphasis on the humanities and downplayed science and technology. The Hellenistic period was something of an exception to that when everything was promoted, but still, this was a period that did not last forever, and by the time we get to the late Hellenistic period and late Republic, both of which end in 31 BCE with the triumph of Octavian, we see that knowledge of Britain really hadn't advanced that much. Diodorus Siculus was a major historian living on Sicily, and he wrote at some point between 60 and 30 BCE. He was an armchair historian who does not seem to have traveled very widely, and he often was uncritical in his use of sources. He tells us basically that the island was triangular, that it was called Prettanike, or the Prettanike Island. So we believe that the original term Pythias was Prettanike, and already it's been corrupted by Diodorus, if not someone earlier. He also tells us that the tribes in Britain are politically divided, that they have many different leaders, and yet for the most part this subsistent society is mostly peaceful. Diodorus has a somewhat romanticized view of the Britons, saying that although they are primitive, they still ride chariots, and they almost live as if they are straight out of Homer, that they are peaceful, and he seems to find the place to be a good example of moral virtue. He says that because of their lack of prosperity, that they lack a lot of vices. And that's actually a common trope that we'll see in a whole lot of Greek and Roman literature about the barbarians beyond their borders, that they lack vices because they have not been exposed to the corrupting influence of civilization. There's also Caesar, who was a contemporary of Diodorus, and unlike Diodorus, Caesar was someone who went to Britain twice. So he went there in force. He also had scouts who mapped it out for him, at least in part, and he would actually land twice. Interestingly enough, though, despite the fact that he went there in person, he repeated Diodorus's line that Britain is fundamentally triangular. There's a good chance that he never really scouted out anything beyond the southeast, and that he simply repeated what he might have read in an earlier source, perhaps Pythias. So he really, aside from being able to name a few places and describe a few things, doesn't really tell us all that much about Britain as a geographical location or from an anthropological perspective, aside from talking about how a lot of these tribes had chariots, which was something that had long ceased to be the case on continental Europe. Another source who came a little bit after this, but not by much, he would about be contemporary with Augustus, so he's writing in the very late 1st century BCE, very early 1st century CE, would be Strabo, an Alexandria-based geographer. So he's still pre-Roman conquest. And Strabo tells us basically that almost everything Pythias said was a lie and a guess. That there is no island of Thule, that a number of people have gone to Britain and Ireland and not located it, and so Thule must have been an invention of Pythias, who just wanted to sell books. He also says that Pythias's estimates of the island size were way off, although based on a lot of the reports that we have, and again, these are all second and third hand, most modern scholars actually think that Pythias's estimate was probably just about spot on. But part of that comes down to a controversy over the length of the Greek stade, which is a whole can of worms we're not opening now, because there are lots of different definitions of what a stade is. Anyhow, Strabo at this late date also says that Pythias lied about the existence of ice. He said that there can be no such thing. And so yeah, there you go. Even at this late date, someone is still denying that if you sail far enough north, you can't have ice. Which, interestingly, people always talk about how Diodorus Siculus was uncritical, but Diodorus actually says that if you're that far north, it must be very cold. And Strabo actually repeats that and says that most of the guesses Pythias made about people having limited options for agriculture must be true because it must be cold. And Strabo also tells us about the sort of honeyed alcohol that Pythias drank, perhaps a kind of honey beer. Anyway, the sort of overarching theme you might see is that when we think about issues like what Britain would actually be shaped like or something like that, we have to remember something important. And that is that if you are a truly cultured gentleman scholar, you're writing for an audience of leisured people who will be highly educated and attuned to things such as literary themes and a rich vocabulary and grammar, but because they are men of leisure, they will not want to have to work with technical vocabulary. And so, one of the tendencies in ancient sources is to avoid any kind of technicalities. So, it might not so much be the case that someone like Caesar didn't know that calling Britain a triangle is a bad description, so much as he simply didn't want to get bogged down in details and give those to his reader. In fact, in, say, ancient Greek Athenian assemblies, when they would be debating public policy, mostly the rich gentleman politicians would debate large-scale policy initiatives such as where do we invade next, whereas more common, humble men would come up and give details about how they should start building their bows on their warships or whatever. So in general, getting into technical detail was seen as a kind of lower class thing, and if you're a cultured writer who wants to be taken seriously, you want to avoid technical vocabulary and hyper precision. Another way to show off your learnedness, of course, is to use anachronistic terms. So, for instance, we know the Scythians were no longer living in what is now Ukraine by about the 2nd century BCE, and yet many Roman historians from much later than that will refer to the people of that area as Scythians, because they're trying to show off, I read Herodotus, aren't I special? In 43 CE, the Roman Emperor Claudius, who was already middle-aged without any real successes to his name, wanted to legitimize himself, and one way to do that was to add to the glory of the Roman Empire. And so he approved of an invasion of Britain with 4 legions, and unlike Caesar, who was just trying to impress people back in Rome, Claudius wanted to actually grab onto the land and keep it. And so his invasion was one designed to stick. And so from Claudius's time forward, the Romans would have a strong hold in Britain, a direct governance of much of the island. You would think that this would lead to a massive increase in the amount of interest and knowledge about Britain, but it really doesn't, shockingly enough. Even with Romans literally living there, they still don't really record all that much information about the island. A generation or so after Claudius, Pliny the Elder, who would have probably already been an adult when the conquest happened, was now the commander of the Roman fleet at Misenum, the main Roman fleet in the Western Mediterranean, and he was also composing a work called The Natural History, which talked about all kinds of exotic facts, things that were really impressive and interesting to him. And he draws upon the lost historian Timaeus to talk about the size of Britain. And Timaeus, by the way, would have been sometime in the 2nd century BCE. So although Pliny lives in an era when the Romans literally have a presence in Britain, he's actually drawing upon a Greek historian from a couple centuries ago. And he gives some place names, presumably from Timaeus, including Scandia, which sounds pretty promising. And he also talks about the island of Thule, which he says can be reached from some of these other islands he names, such as the aforementioned Scandii, Dumna, the Bergi, Berii. He also says that if you go one day sail from Thule, you'll reach the frozen sea that apparently now has a name, the Cronian Sea. And that's really all we can get from Pliny the Elder, who again seems to be drawing upon old information. Apparently no Romans had decided to go up and do an easier version of Pythias's voyage, which might sound bizarre to us, but the Romans were not nearly so intellectually curious as the Greeks. So you might wonder, okay, now that the Romans are in this area, surely they must have drawn a map to give the coastline of Britain and show how it fits precisely into their empire. What you might not realize is that Roman maps are not geographically precise representations of landmasses, but rather kind of blocky itineraries which just show the paths of great roads in a kind of schematic way. They're not designed to be very accurate, just to be guides to, if you follow the Via Appia or whatever road it might be, here are the cities along the path. And so that's partly why Roman maps aren't what we would think of as accurate, because that's not what they're designed to be. But also the aforementioned lack of intellectual curiosity by the Romans is another factor here. So yes, despite the fact the Romans now occupy Britain, they still really don't have a whole lot to say about it. There is one major contribution that the Romans made to the history of Britain, at least in terms of specific Roman authors, and that is changing the name of the island. So rather than calling it Prettanike as Pythias had, and that name, by the way, seems to have been based in the Celtic word for the island, at least the word that's related to the modern Welsh Prydain, the Romans started to call the island Britannia. So effectively from Prettanike then was morphed by other Greeks into Britannia or something like that, and then the Romans turned it into Britannia. Although Pliny the Elder, who we talked about a minute ago, also called it Albion at one point, which is another name that is stuck. And so this island is known so imprecisely that it somehow has two names, even though there's only now one master of the island. We also have continuing source uncertainty. There's a source that has been falsely attributed to Aristotle, but was probably from a later period, which says things about the difference between Britain and Ireland that don't make sense. And then the crowning kind of example of how Britain still really didn't quite penetrate the Greek and Roman imagination and capture their best efforts comes to us from Claudius Ptolemaeus. So you can tell by his name that he's a Roman citizen with a Roman patron, but he actually is working in Alexandria as a geographer. And despite the fact that this is his chosen profession, and that Britain has been within the empire of which he's also a part for a full century, his account of what Britain looks like and how it's shaped and its dimensions is quite substantially wrong. As you see from the map here, his account of Ireland is not that far off, but his account of the main island, aside from the southwest coast, is way off. And given that the first real accounts we have of British geography in detail come from Caesar, who got the southeast coast right, I really have absolutely no clue how he managed to botch this so badly. The point is, though, that the Greeks and Romans, while they had some interest in Britain, that interest was, by our standards, rather superficial. And so this means that Britain was still a place of mystery to them, even as some of them lived there. So as we move along through Britain's ancient history, we'll see that we have to rely fairly heavily upon guesswork at times, because for Greek writers and their Roman rulers, the people of Britain were very much a tertiary concern. People who were interesting enough to record on occasion, but not really worthy of deep and sustained examination.